The old community center clock showed 6:45 p.m. when Maria quietly slipped through the heavy wooden doors. She was 15 minutes early, just like always. The hallway smelled of fresh coffee and old books, a comforting mix that reminded her of the library where she used to take her children when they were small. Maria walked slowly down the long corridor, her soft-soled shoes making barely a sound on the polished floor. She passed colorful posters advertising cooking classes, computer lessons, and art workshops. At 52, she felt both excited and nervous about being back in school after so many years. The classroom door was already open. Maria peeked inside and saw about 15 other students chatting quietly while they waited. Most of them looked younger than her, maybe in their 20s and 30s. She felt a familiar flutter in her stomach, the same feeling she got when she started any new job or faced any new challenge. She chose a seat in the back corner away from the main group. It was her usual spot in any room, where she could see everything but stay mostly unnoticed. She pulled out a worn notebook and a blue pen from her canvas bag, the same bag she had been using for the past 5 years. Maria had worked at Tony's diner for almost 2 decades. She knew every regular customer's order by heart. She could balance 4 plates on one arm and remember who wanted extra sugar in their coffee without writing anything down. But she had never finished high school, and that fact had bothered her for years. When her youngest son graduated from college last spring, something inside her shifted. She realized she had spent 33 years taking care of everyone else. Her 4 children, her elderly mother, her customers at the diner. Maybe it was time to do something just for herself. The GED classes met 3 times a week. Math on Mondays, English on Wednesdays, and this music appreciation class on Fridays. She had signed up for music almost by accident. The counselor had told her she needed 1 elective credit, and music seemed less scary than science or history. Mrs. Henderson walked into the room right at 7 o'clock. She was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and silver hair that she wore in a neat bob. She carried a leather bag filled with CDs, sheet music, and what looked like a small portable speaker. "Good evening, everyone," Mrs. Henderson said with a warm smile. "I hope you all had a good week." The students settled into their seats. Maria noticed that Mrs. Henderson always remembered to ask about their lives outside of class. Last week she had asked about Maria's work at the diner and seemed genuinely interested in the answer. "Tonight, we're going to explore something really special," Mrs. Henderson continued, setting up her equipment. "We're going to talk about opera and how it can express the deepest human emotions." Some students looked skeptical. A young man in the front row made a face like he had tasted something sour. A woman with bright red hair whispered something to her friend that made them both giggle. Maria, however, felt her heart skip a beat. Opera. She knew opera better than anyone in this room could imagine, though she had never told a soul about. It had started years ago during a particularly difficult time in her life. Her husband had left when her youngest was only 3, and she was working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. The stress was overwhelming, and some nights she would lie awake wondering how she would manage everything. One evening, exhausted after a double shift, she was flipping through radio stations in her small apartment. She stopped when she heard the most beautiful sound she had ever encountered, a woman's voice soaring over a full orchestra, singing in a language she didn't understand but somehow felt in her bones. It was her first introduction to opera, and it changed everything. She started listening to the classical music station every night after the children went to bed. She would turn the volume low and lose herself in the music while she folded laundry or prepared for the next day. Over the years, she began to learn the stories behind the operas. She discovered that they were filled with real human emotions: love, loss, hope, despair. She found comfort in knowing that people hundreds of years ago had felt the same things she was feeling. Slowly, quietly, she began to sing along. At first, she just hummed the melodies. Then she started learning the words, even though they were in Italian, French, and German. She bought used CDs from the thrift store and listened to them until she knew every note by heart. But this was her secret. At the diner, she was just Maria, who remembered your coffee order and always had a kind word when you were having a bad day. At parent-teacher conferences, she was just another single mom doing her best. In this classroom, she was just another middle-aged woman trying to finish her education. Mrs. Henderson pressed play on her CD player, and the opening notes of a famous aria filled the room. Maria recognized it immediately. It was from an opera, about a young woman pleading with her father to let her marry the man she loved. This piece is called O mio babbino caro, Mrs. Henderson explained. It's sung by a daughter who is begging her father to understand her feelings. Listen to how the music itself tells the story. As the soprano's voice flowed through the small speakers, Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had listened to this particular aria hundreds of times, but hearing it in this setting, surrounded by other people, made it feel new and powerful. She noticed that several students had stopped, fidgeting. Even the skeptical young man in the front row was listening intently. Music had a way of reaching people when they least expected it. Mrs. Henderson paused the recording partway through. You can hear the emotion in her voice, can't you? She doesn't. Just sing the notes, she lives them. This is what makes opera so special. It's not just music, it's storytelling at its most powerful. She looked around the room, making eye contact with several students. The human voice is the most versatile instrument we have. It can whisper like the wind or soar like a bird. It can express joy so pure it makes you want to dance, or sadness so deep it breaks your heart. Maria found herself nodding along. She knew exactly what Mrs. Henderson meant. During those long, difficult years when she was struggling to raise her children alone, opera had been her emotional outlet. When she couldn't afford to go to movies or concerts, she could always lose herself in the music that played softly in her small living room. Now, I know some of you might think opera is old-fashioned or boring, Mrs. Henderson continued with a knowing smile, but the emotions it expresses are timeless. Love, fear, hope, courage. These feelings haven't changed in thousands of years. She walked over to the old piano that sat in the corner of the classroom. It was clearly well used, with scratches on its wooden surface and keys that were slightly yellowed with age. But when Mrs. Henderson pressed the keys, the sound that emerged was clear and beautiful. Let me play this melody for you, she said, beginning the same aria they had just heard. I want you to listen, not just with your ears, but with your hearts. As the simple piano version filled the room, Maria felt something stirring inside her. Her fingers tapped quietly against her notebook, following the rhythm she knew so well. Her breathing changed, becoming deeper and more controlled, the way it always did when she listened to music at home. Mrs. Henderson finished playing and turned back to the class. Music like this isn't meant to be experienced alone, she said. It's meant to be shared. In the old days, people would gather in opera houses not just to listen, but to feel together, to share in the emotional journey. She paused, looking thoughtful. You know, I always think it's wonderful when students connect with music on a personal level. Sometimes the most beautiful performances come from people who truly understand what the music is trying to say. Her eyes swept across the room, taking in each student's face. When her gaze reached Maria, she seemed to pause for just a moment. There was something in Maria's expression, a deep attention, a genuine understanding that went beyond casual interest. Music has the power to reveal parts of ourselves we didn't even know existed, Mrs. Henderson continued. Sometimes we discover talents or passions that have been sleeping inside us, waiting for the right moment to wake up. Maria felt her cheeks grow warm. It was as if Mrs. Henderson was speaking directly to her, though she knew that was impossible. How could anyone know about her secret love affair with opera, about the hours she spent singing softly along to her favorite arias? The class continued with Mrs. Henderson explaining different types of voices: soprano, alto, tenor, bass. She talked about how each voice type could express different emotions and tell different parts of a story. Maria knew all of this already, but she enjoyed hearing it explained so clearly and enthusiastically. As the evening progressed, Mrs. Henderson played examples from different operas. She shared stories about famous singers and composers, painting pictures of grand opera houses and emotional performances that moved audiences to tears. With about 15 minutes left in class, Mrs. Henderson made an announcement that would change everything. I'd like to try something different tonight, she said, moving back to the piano. I want to demonstrate how different people can bring their own interpretation to the same piece of music. Would anyone be willing to try singing along with this melody? The room fell completely silent. Students looked down at their desks or stared at the walls anywhere but at Mrs. Henderson. The idea of singing in front of others was clearly terrifying to most of them. Don't worry about being perfect, Mrs. Henderson encouraged. This isn't about having a trained voice, it's about connecting with the music and sharing that connection with others. Still, no one volunteered. Maria felt her heart pounding. She wanted to raise her hand, but 33 years of staying in the background were hard to overcome. Mrs. Henderson tried a different approach. Let me ask this way. I've noticed that some of you seem to really connect with what we're discussing. Maria, she said, looking directly at her, I can see that this music speaks to you. Would you mind giving it a try? Every eye in the classroom turned toward the back corner where Maria sat. She felt frozen, caught between her desire to remain invisible and something deeper, a longing that had been growing stronger with each passing week of class. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her pen. This was the moment she had both dreaded and secretly hoped for. After all these years of singing alone in her apartment, someone was asking her to share her voice with the world. Maria's mouth felt dry as she stared at Mrs. Henderson. The teacher's kind eyes were waiting patiently, and Maria could feel 15 pairs of curious eyes watching her every move. Her first instinct was to shake her head and mumble an excuse about not being a singer. That's what the old Maria would have done, the Maria who had spent decades making herself small and invisible. But something was different tonight. Maybe it was the way Mrs. Henderson had talked about music revealing hidden parts of ourselves. Maybe it was the memory of all those lonely evenings when opera had been her only companion through the hardest times. Or maybe it was simply that she was tired of hiding. I don't know, Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. I've never sung in front of people before. Mrs. Henderson smiled gently and walked closer to Maria's desk. That's perfectly okay. There's a first time for everything. And you know what? Some of the most beautiful music comes from people who sing from their hearts rather than from years of formal training. The young man in the front row turned around to look at Maria. His expression wasn't mocking like she had feared. Instead, he looked curious and even a little encouraging. The woman with red hair gave her a small nod as if to say, "Go ahead. We're all friends here." Maria's hands were shaking as she slowly closed her notebook. She had imagined this moment countless times over the years, what it would feel like to share her voice with others. In her daydreams, she was always confident and graceful. In reality, her legs felt like jelly as she started to stand up. "Take your time," Mrs. Henderson said softly. "There's no pressure at all. If you change your mind, that's completely fine too." But Maria was already on her feet. Something inside her had made the decision before her mind could talk her out of it. She walked slowly to the front of the classroom, each step feeling both terrifying and liberating. The other students watched with genuine interest. There was no judgment in their faces, only curiosity about what would happen next. Maria realized that they were all adults here, all people who had their own struggles and dreams. They weren't here to laugh at anyone. They were here to learn and grow, just like she was. Mrs. Henderson moved to the old piano and placed her hands gently on the keys. "I'm going to play the same piece we listened to earlier, O mio babbino caro. Do you know it?" Maria nodded, not trusting her voice to speak. Of course she knew it. She had sung along to it hundreds of times in her small apartment, usually while doing dishes or folding clothes. It was one of her favorites because it told the story of a daughter's love and desperation, emotions she understood deeply from her own life as a mother. "The words are in Italian," Mrs. Henderson explained to the class, "but the emotion is universal. It's about a young woman pleading with her father to understand her heart. Maria, would you like me to write out some of the words for you?" "No, thank you," Maria said quietly. "I know them." Mrs. Henderson raised her eyebrows in pleasant surprise. "Wonderful. Don't worry about pronunciation. Just sing whatever feels natural to you." Maria stood beside the piano, her hands clasped. in front of her. She looked out at the classroom and saw faces filled with expectation and kindness. These people were rooting for her, she realized. They wanted her to succeed. Mrs. Henderson began to play the opening notes. The melody floated through the room, and Maria felt something shift inside her chest. It was as if a door that had been locked for 33 years was slowly creaking open. The first few notes came out softly, tentatively. "O mio babbino caro," she sang, her voice barely above a whisper. The Italian words felt familiar on her tongue, like greeting an old friend. Mrs. Henderson's fingers paused on the keys for just a moment. Even those first quiet notes had been perfectly in tune, with a quality that spoke of natural talent and years of private practice. "Keep going," Mrs. Henderson encouraged, resuming the accompaniment. "You're doing beautifully." Maria closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. In her mind, she wasn't standing in a community center classroom anymore. She was back in her tiny apartment kitchen singing softly while her children slept in the next room. She was remembering all the times this music had comforted her, all the evenings when opera had been her escape from a world that seemed too difficult to bear. Her voice grew stronger with each phrase. "Mi piace, è bello bello," she continued, the words flowing naturally. She wasn't thinking about the students watching her anymore. She wasn't worried about making mistakes or being judged. She was simply sharing something that had lived in her heart for decades. The young man in the front row leaned forward in his chair. The woman with red hair had stopped whispering to her friend and was listening intently. Around the room, students, who had seemed bored or distracted earlier, were now completely focused on Maria's performance. But Maria didn't notice their changed expressions. She was lost in the music, in the story she was telling through song. Her voice grew more confident. With each passing measure, years of listening to the world's greatest opera singers had taught her things she didn't even realize she had learned. Her breathing was controlled and steady. Her vibrato was natural and beautiful. Her expression of the melody's emotional peaks and valleys showed an instinctive understanding of the music. Mrs. Henderson found herself playing more and more softly, allowing Maria's voice to fill the room. This was not what she had expected when she asked a shy student to try singing along. This was something extraordinary happening right before her eyes. As Maria reached the more challenging parts of the aria, her technique became even more apparent. She navigated the difficult intervals with ease, her voice soaring effortlessly through the higher passages. The sound she produced was rich and warm, with a quality that professional singers spend years trying to develop. "Vo andare in Porta Rossa a comprar l'anello," Maria sang, her voice building toward the emotional climax of the piece. She was no longer the nervous woman who cleaned tables at the diner, or the self-conscious student who sat in the back of the classroom. She had become something larger than herself, a vessel for the music and emotion that had been building inside her for years. The other students were completely transfixed. This wasn't just someone singing along to a familiar tune. This was artistry at its finest, emerging from the most unexpected source. The shy, quiet woman they had barely noticed week after week was revealing herself to be incredibly gifted. Mrs. Henderson felt tears forming in her eyes as she accompanied Maria through the soaring phrases. In her 40 years of teaching music, she had encountered talented students before, but she had never witnessed such a complete transformation, such raw talent combined with genuine emotional depth. Maria's voice filled every corner of the small room as she approached the aria's most demanding passage. These were the notes that separated casual singers from true artists, the phrases that required not just technical skill but complete emotional commitment. "Sì, sì, ci voglio andare," she sang, her voice rising with confidence and power. "E se l'amassi in d'Arno, andrei sul Ponte Vecchio ma per buttarmi in Arno." The high notes rang out with crystalline clarity. Maria's years of private practice, combined with her natural gifts, had prepared her for this moment even though she had never performed for an audience before. Her voice soared above the piano accompaniment with a beauty that made several students gasp audibly. As she sang the final repetitions of Babbo Pietà Pietà, her voice carried all the longing and hope of the character, but also something deeper, her own years of deferred dreams, her own quiet struggles and small victories. Mrs. Henderson played the final chords, and Maria's voice faded into silence. For a moment, nobody moved. The transformation they had just witnessed seemed too profound to process immediately. Maria opened her eyes slowly, as if waking from a beautiful dream. She looked around the classroom and saw faces filled with amazement, respect, and something approaching awe. The young man, who had seemed skeptical about opera, was staring at her with his mouth slightly open. The woman with red hair had tears streaming down her cheeks. "That was—" Mrs. Henderson began, her voice shaking with emotion. She stopped playing and turned to face Maria directly. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" Maria felt herself shrinking back into her familiar shell of modesty. The spell was broken, and she was just Maria from the diner again, embarrassed by the attention and unsure how to respond to such direct praise. "I don't really sing," she said quietly, wrapping her arms around herself. "I mean, not really. Just sometimes at home when I'm alone." But Mrs. Henderson wasn't going to let her dismiss what had just happened. "Maria, that was professional-level singing. I've taught music for 4 decades, and I know talent when I hear it. What you just did, that takes years of training, or incredible natural ability, or both." The other students began to find their voices. "That was amazing," one of them said. "I got chills listening to you." Another added, "I had no idea opera could sound so beautiful." Maria felt overwhelmed by the attention and praise. For so many years she had kept this part of herself hidden, convinced that it wasn't important or valuable. Hearing others respond so positively to something she had always considered just a private hobby was almost too much to process. "How long have you been singing?" Mrs. Henderson asked gently. Maria hesitated before answering. "Since my children were small," she said. "Finally, it started as a way to cope with difficult times. The music helped me feel less alone." Mrs. Henderson nodded with understanding. "Music has that power. But Maria, what you just shared with us, that's not just coping. That's artistry. That's a gift that deserves to be heard." The classroom felt different now, as if the air itself had changed. Maria stood at the front of the room, still catching her breath from what she had just shared. She could see the wonder in everyone's faces, but part of her couldn't quite believe what had happened. Had she really just sung opera in front of all these people? Mrs. Henderson was still sitting at the piano, her hands resting on the keys. She looked at Maria with eyes full of amazement and something else. Recognition. It was the look of someone who had just discovered something precious that had been hidden away for far too long. "Maria," Mrs. Henderson said softly, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Have you ever had formal voice training?" Maria shook her head quickly. "No, never. I told you I just sing at home sometimes. I listen to the radio and, well, I guess I sing along." "Just sing along," Mrs. Henderson repeated, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Maria, what you just did isn't just singing along. That was a performance that would make professional opera singers proud." The young man in the front row raised his hand tentatively. "Can I ask something? How do you know all those Italian words? I mean, that sounded like you've been speaking Italian your whole life." Maria felt her cheeks grow warm again. This was the part she had never told anyone, not even her own children. I taught myself. Over the years, I would listen to the same songs over and over until I learned the words. Then I would look up what they meant in English. I have a whole collection of CDs at home." "A whole collection?" Mrs. Henderson leaned forward with interest. "Well, not exactly new ones," Maria admitted. "I buy them used from thrift stores and garage sales. Whenever I find opera CDs, I get them. I must have about 50 or 60 by now. I know that's not very many compared to real collectors, but—" "Maria," Mrs. Henderson interrupted gently, "that's wonderful. It shows how much you love this music. But I have to tell you something. What you just demonstrated isn't something you can learn just from listening to CDs. You have natural talent that is truly rare." Around the room, other students were nodding in agreement. A middle-aged woman, who usually sat near the window, spoke up. "I've been to the Opera House downtown a few times, and honestly, Some of the professional singers there don't sound as good as you just did." Maria felt overwhelmed by all the attention and compliments. She had spent so many years being invisible, being just another face in the crowd. This level of praise and recognition felt almost too much to handle. Mrs. Henderson stood up from the piano bench and walked over to Maria. "I want to try something if you're willing. There's another piece I'd like you to hear. It's a bit more challenging, but I have a feeling you might know it." She returned to the piano and began playing a different melody. Maria recognized it immediately. It was Ave Maria by Schubert, one of the most beautiful and technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. She had been singing along to this song for years, usually late at night when the world was quiet and she felt safe to let her voice soar. "Do you know this one?" Mrs. Henderson asked. Maria nodded, her heart starting to beat faster. This was one of her absolute favorites, but it was also one of the most challenging pieces she had ever attempted. The thought of singing it in front of other people was both thrilling and terrifying. "I know it," she said quietly, "but it's very difficult. I'm not sure I can do it justice in front of everyone." "Maria," Mrs. Henderson said firmly but kindly, "after what we just heard, I think you can do this piece more than justice. But only if you want to. There's no pressure at all." The room was completely silent as everyone waited for Maria's decision. She looked around at the faces watching her, faces full of encouragement and genuine curiosity about what she might do next. These people had gone from barely noticing her to hanging on her every word in the span of just a few minutes. Maria took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay, I'll try." Mrs. Henderson smiled and positioned her hands on the keyboard. "Take your time. Start whenever you feel ready." The opening notes of Ave Maria filled the small classroom. This piece was different from the first one. It was slower, more reverent, and required even more control and emotional depth. Maria closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. When she began to sing, something magical happened. Her voice, which had been beautiful before, now took on an almost ethereal quality. The Latin words flowed from her lips with perfect pronunciation and deep understanding. "Ave Maria, gratia plena," she sang, her voice pure and clear as mountain water. The transformation in the room was immediate and profound. Students who had been impressed before were now completely mesmerized. This wasn't just good singing. This was the kind of performance that made people believe in something greater than themselves. Maria's voice soared through the challenging passages with breathtaking ease. The high notes were crystal clear and perfectly controlled. The soft passages were delivered with such tenderness that several people in the room felt tears coming to their eyes. Mrs. Henderson found herself playing more delicately than she ever had before, allowing Maria's voice to be the star of the performance. She had accompanied hundreds of singers over the years, but she had never experienced anything quite like this. Maria wasn't just singing the notes, she was living the music, breathing life into every phrase. As Maria reached the most demanding part of the piece, her voice rose with power that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her soul. The classroom, which had felt small and ordinary just minutes before, now seemed transformed into a sacred space. Her voice filled every corner of the room, wrapping around each listener like a warm embrace. "Sancta Maria, Mater Dei," Maria sang, her voice building to the emotional climax of the piece. The words carried not just the meaning of the Latin text, but years of her own hopes, struggles, and quiet faith. Every person in the room could feel the genuine emotion behind each note. The young man in the front row had tears streaming down his face. He had come to this class thinking it would be an easy credit, something to get through quickly. He had never expected to witness something so beautiful and moving. The woman with red hair was recording on her phone, though she was so captivated by the performance that her hands were shaking slightly. She knew she was witnessing something special, something that needed to be preserved and shared. Maria's voice floated through the final phrases of the song with such beauty that it seemed to suspend time itself. "Ora pro nobis peccatoribus," she sang, her voice soft but filled with profound meaning. "Nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen." The last note hung in the air like a perfect crystal, pure and clear and seemingly endless. When it finally faded into silence, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The room was filled with the kind of silence that only follows something truly extraordinary. Then, as if awakening from a beautiful dream, the applause began. It started slowly, with just one person clapping, then another, until the entire room erupted in enthusiastic appreciation. Several students rose to their feet, unable to contain their amazement at what they had just witnessed. "Incredible," someone whispered. "Absolutely incredible." "I've never heard anything so beautiful in my life," another student said. Mrs. Henderson was clapping with tears streaming down her face. In 4 decades of teaching music, she had never been so moved by a student's performance. This wasn't just talent. This was artistry at its highest level, emerging from the most unexpected source. Maria opened her eyes and looked around the room in amazement. She had been so lost in the music that she had almost forgotten where she was. Seeing the emotional responses of her classmates, the tears, the smiles, the genuine amazement, she felt something shift inside her heart. For the first time in her adult life, Maria felt truly seen, not as the quiet waitress who remembered everyone's coffee order, not as the struggling single mother who worked double shifts, but as someone with something beautiful and valuable to offer the world. "Maria," Mrs. Henderson said, wiping tears from her eyes, "I need you to understand something. What you just shared with us, that's not a hobby. That's not something you do just for fun. That's a gift that most people would spend their entire lives trying to develop." A student near the back of the room raised her hand. "Can I ask where you learned to sing with such emotion? I mean, it felt like you were telling us your whole life story through that song." Maria thought about the question for a moment before answering. "I think," she said slowly, "that when you've lived through difficult times, when you've experienced loss and struggle and hope, the music becomes a way to express all of those feelings. Every time I sing, I'm not just singing the notes. I'm sharing everything I've learned about life." Mrs. Henderson nodded with deep understanding. "That's what separates good singers from great ones. Technique can be taught, but the ability to connect with the deepest human emotions that comes from living, from experiencing life fully." The classroom gradually returned to normal as students began gathering their things, but the atmosphere remained charged with excitement. Small groups formed as people discussed what they had just witnessed, and Maria found herself surrounded by classmates who wanted to talk with her, to learn more about her musical journey. For the first time in decades, Maria felt like she belonged, somewhere special. She wasn't just taking up space in the back row anymore. She had become the center of something beautiful and meaningful, and the feeling was both wonderful and overwhelming. The weeks following that extraordinary Friday evening changed Maria's life in ways she never could have imagined. As she walked home from class that night, she felt like she was floating on air. The autumn wind that usually made her pull her worn coat tighter around her shoulders now felt refreshing and alive. For the first time in decades, Maria felt truly alive too. She couldn't stop thinking about the faces in that classroom. The amazement, the tears, the genuine appreciation for something she had always kept hidden. When she reached her small apartment, she looked at her collection of opera CDs with new eyes. These weren't just entertainment anymore. They were her teachers, her companions in a journey she was only beginning to understand. That weekend, Maria found herself humming while she worked her shifts at the diner. The regular customers noticed something different about her. She seemed lighter somehow, more confident in her movements. When old Mr. Peterson asked for his usual coffee and pancakes, Maria smiled more brightly than usual. "You seem happy today." "Maria," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Something good happened to you?" Maria paused, coffee pot in hand. For a moment she considered telling him about Friday night, about discovering that her secret hobby might be something more, but the old habits of staying quiet were still strong. "Just a good day," she said simply, refilling his cup. But word was already spreading in ways Maria didn't expect. The woman with red hair from her class had shared the phone recording she made with her sister, who was a music teacher at the local high school. By Monday morning, that recording had been sent to several people in the local music community. Maria's phone rang Tuesday evening, just as she was settling down with a cup of tea and her favorite Puccini CD. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Hello, is this Maria?" The voice was warm but professional. "My name is Dr. Rebecca Chen, and I'm the director of the Community Opera Company here in town. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I received a recording of your performance from Friday night and I simply had to reach out to you." Maria nearly dropped her phone. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. I'm not a professional singer or anything like that." "Oh, but Maria, that's exactly why I'm calling. What you demonstrated in that recording is exceptional. I've been directing opera for 20 years and I know real talent when I hear it. Would you be willing to meet with me? I'd love to talk with you about some opportunities we have coming up." Maria's heart was racing. "Opportunities? I don't understand. I just sing for fun in my spare time. I work at a diner and I'm trying to finish my GED. I'm not the kind of person who belongs in opera." Dr. Chen's voice was kind but firm. "Maria, talent doesn't care about your job or your education level. Some of the greatest singers in history came from humble backgrounds. What matters is the gift you have and what you choose to do with it." They arranged to meet at the community center the following Saturday. Maria spent the rest of the week alternating between excitement and terror. She told her children about the phone call and they were amazed and proud, though not entirely surprised. "Mom, we always knew you had a beautiful voice," her oldest daughter said during their weekly phone call. "Remember how you used to sing us to sleep when we were little? We never forgot those lullabies." Maria had forgotten about those nights years ago when money was tight and bedtime stories were a luxury they couldn't afford. She would sit by their beds and sing softly until they drifted off to sleep. She never realized her children had treasured those moments. Saturday arrived gray and drizzly, matching Maria's nervous mood. She arrived at the community center 30 minutes early and sat in her car, trying to calm her racing heart. When Dr. Chen arrived, Maria was surprised to see a petite woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an easy smile. "You must be Maria," Dr. Chen said, extending her hand. "Thank you so much for meeting with me. I know this must feel overwhelming." They went inside to the same classroom where everything had started. Mrs. Henderson had arranged to meet them there, bringing her warm smile and the familiar old piano. "I've been thinking about that night all week," Mrs. Henderson said as she hugged Maria. "I keep replaying it in my mind, wondering if it really happened the way I remember." Dr. Chen had brought sheet music and a small digital recorder. "Maria, I'd like to hear you sing something live if you're willing. I want to make sure that recording wasn't just a lucky moment." Maria felt the familiar flutter of nerves, but this time it was mixed with something else, curiosity about what might happen next. She chose to sing Caro Nome from Rigoletto, one of her favorite pieces that she had been practicing for years in her kitchen. As her voice filled the room once again, Dr. Chen sat perfectly still, listening with the trained ear of someone who had worked with hundreds of singers. When Maria finished, Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment. "Maria," she said finally, "I need to be completely honest with you. In my 20 years of working with opera singers, I've rarely encountered natural talent like yours. Your voice has qualities that most singers spend decades trying to develop. Perfect pitch, natural vibrato, exceptional breath control, and most importantly, the ability to convey deep emotion through music." Maria felt overwhelmed by the praise. "But I'm 52 years old. Isn't it too late to start a singing career?" Dr. Chen smiled. "Some of the world's most celebrated opera singers didn't begin their professional careers until their 40s or 50s. Your voice has maturity and life experience that younger singers often lack. The emotions you bring to these pieces come from having lived a full life." Over the next hour, Dr. Chen explained the world Maria had only dreamed about. She talked about the Community Opera Company's upcoming season, about small roles that might be perfect for someone just beginning their professional journey, about voice coaches who could help Maria refine her already impressive technique. "We have a production of La Bohème starting rehearsals in January," Dr. Chen explained. "There's a small role, Musetta's friend in the cafe scene. It's not a leading part, but it would give you a chance to experience what it's like to perform on stage with a full orchestra and chorus. Maria's eyes grew wide. She had listened to La Bohème hundreds of times, had sung along to every aria and duet. The thought of actually being part of a production seemed like an impossible dream. I would need to audition, wouldn't I? Maria asked nervously. Consider what you just did your audition, Dr. Chen said with a smile. If you're interested, the role is yours. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of new experiences. Maria began working with a voice coach, a patient woman who helped her understand the technical aspects of what she had been doing naturally for years. She learned about proper breathing techniques, about voice placement and projection, about the subtle differences between performing in a small room and singing in a large theater. The first rehearsal was terrifying and exhilarating. Maria walked into the community theater and saw dozens of people, singers, musicians, directors, costume designers, all working together to create something magical. She felt like an imposter at first, convinced that someone would realize she didn't belong there. But as soon as she began singing with the other performers, she felt at home. The music she had loved in solitude for so many years was now shared, amplified by the voices around her and supported by a full orchestra. It was everything she had dreamed it might be, and more. Her co-workers at the diner were amazed by the change in Maria. She still worked her regular shifts, but now she talked about voice lessons and rehearsals with an excitement they had never seen before. Regular customers noticed that she hummed while she worked, and her smile seemed brighter. "You're different lately," Mr. Peterson observed one morning over his usual breakfast. "Happier, I think." This time Maria didn't hesitate to share her story. She told him about the music class, about discovering her voice, about the opera role she was preparing for. Mr. Peterson listened with growing amazement. "Well, I'll be," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "All these years we had a real opera, singer serving our coffee, and we never knew it." Word spread through the small town about Maria's transformation. The local newspaper ran a feature story about her journey from diner waitress to opera performer. The article caught the attention of people far beyond her hometown. A video of her performance taken during one of the early rehearsals was shared on social media. Within days, it had been viewed thousands of times. Comments poured in from around the world, people amazed by her story, inspired by her courage to pursue her dreams later in life. On opening night of La Bohème, Maria stood in the wings wearing a beautiful period costume, her hair styled in elaborate curls. She could hear the orchestra tuning up and the audience settling into their seats. Her hands were shaking slightly, but it was the good kind of nervousness, the kind that meant something important was about to happen. Mrs. Henderson was in the audience, having bought tickets the moment they went on sale. Dr. Chen was backstage, offering last-minute encouragement to the entire cast. Maria's children had driven in from surrounding cities to see their mother's debut. When her moment came, Maria walked onto the stage and into the warm glow of the spotlights. The theater was filled with people, but as soon as she began to sing, the nervousness melted away. This was where she belonged. This was what she had been preparing for unknowingly for decades. Her voice soared through the theater, reaching every corner with clarity and emotion. In the audience, Mrs. Henderson wiped away tears of pride and joy. Maria's children sat in amazement seeing their mother in a completely new light. After the performance, as Maria took her bow with the rest of the cast, she looked out at the audience and felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for Mrs. Henderson's encouragement, for Dr. Chen's belief in her talent, for her children's support, and for all those years of secret practice that had prepared her for this moment. Later that evening, as Maria hung up her costume and prepared to return to her normal life, she realized that nothing would ever be quite normal again. She had discovered not just her voice, but herself. She had learned that dreams don't have expiration dates and that it's never too late to let your true self shine. The shy woman who had sat in the back of the classroom just months before was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and wasn't afraid to share her gifts with the world.